When Sarah and I first started dating, I would have sworn she was the most genuine, loving person I'd ever met. Her laugh was infectious, her eyes sparkled when she talked about her dreams, and she had this way of making every moment feel special. I never imagined that one day, I'd be sneaking around behind her back, but not for the reasons you might think. We'd been married for 7 years, and at first, everything was perfect. Then, little things began to change. Sarah started coming home later from work, claiming her advertising firm was swamped with deadlines. I didn't think much of it at first. She'd always been ambitious, and her career was important to her. But then came the subtle shifts, the late-night phone calls she claimed were just Karen from accounting, the sudden interest in going to the gym, and the sparkly new perfume she didn't even bother to mention. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was all in my head. But doubt has a funny way of creeping in and settling down like an unwelcome guest. So, when I found an AirTag while cleaning out a drawer in the garage, a crazy idea started forming. I'd bought it months ago to keep track of my bike when we went on road trips, but I'd never actually used it. Now, I had a different use in mind. It felt ridiculous at first, like something out of a spy movie. But after another late night of Sarah working overtime, my hands moved on their own. I slipped the AirTag into the side pocket of her purse, buried beneath tissues and makeup she rarely used. I told myself it was just to prove I was being paranoid, that it was all a misunderstanding. But it wasn't paranoia. The first ping came the following night. Sarah had left for another late meeting, and I was nursing a beer on the couch when my phone buzzed. I stared at the notification, my heart hammering in my chest. The AirTag was in a location I didn't recognize, a bar on the other side of town. I could have convinced myself it was work-related if it wasn't for the fact that she told me she was meeting a client in the city center. I didn't say anything when she came home, her smile wide and fake as she kissed me on the cheek. "How was your night?" she asked casually, like she wasn't carrying the weight of a lie on her shoulders. "Fine," I replied, matching her nonchalance. But inside, a storm was brewing. The next week followed the same pattern. The AirTag painted a picture Sarah wasn't willing to admit to. Coffee shops miles away from her office. Extended work trips to a hotel she wasn't registered at. It was all too neat, too deliberate. Still, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I was blowing things out of proportion. I didn't want to believe my wife was capable of betrayal. Then, one Friday evening, I got another notification. This time, it wasn't a random bar or hotel. It was a quiet street near a park. I grabbed my jacket, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest, and drove to the location. It wasn't until I parked a few houses away that I realized I didn't even know what I was looking for. I sat in my car, staring at the glowing dot on my phone's screen, the weight of reality pressing down on me. Was I really doing this? Was I about to catch Sarah in the act? I didn't get out. Not yet. But as the hours ticked by and Sarah didn't return home, my resolve hardened. This wasn't paranoia anymore. It was something worse. By the time she got back that night, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront her just yet. Instead, I was going to gather the pieces of this twisted puzzle and see the picture they formed. I wanted to know everything: who, what, where, and why. And so began the longest game of my life. After that Friday night, I couldn't unsee the cracks in our life. Every smile Sarah gave me felt rehearsed, every kiss like an apology for something she wasn't ready to confess. I kept the AirTag in place, and each ping became a piece of a story she wouldn't tell. I had no intention of confronting her yet. I wanted to be sure. Completely sure. The following Monday, Sarah claimed she had an early meeting at the office. Normally, she left around 8 a.m., but today, she was out the door by 6:30, dressed sharper than usual. Her black pencil skirt hugged her hips, and she wore a red blouse I'd only seen her wear a handful of times, usually for special occasions. I kissed her goodbye like nothing was wrong, but as soon as she pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my phone. The AirTag showed her heading downtown, But instead of stopping at her office, the dot moved to a location a few blocks away, a small cafe I didn't recognize. I decided to follow. The cafe was one of those trendy spots with exposed brick walls and overpriced lattes. I parked across the street and spotted her almost immediately through the large window. She wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was a man in his mid-30s, lean and dressed in a crisp button-down shirt. He leaned in as she spoke, his smile easy and intimate. I couldn't hear their conversation, but the body language was unmistakable. She laughed at something he said, throwing her head back in a way that made her look carefree, something she hadn't been with me in months. When he reached across the table and brushed her hand with his, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to storm in and demand answers, but I held back. There was no proof yet, no concrete evidence. For all I knew, this guy could be a colleague or an old friend. Still, the scene didn't sit right with me. When Sarah got home that evening, she acted like everything was normal. She even made my favorite dinner, lasagna, the kind with extra cheese. As we sat at the table, her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at it briefly before flipping it face down on the counter. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Yeah," she replied with a tired smile. "The usual chaos. Meetings, deadlines. You know how it is." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Did you have lunch today?" Her fork paused midair for a fraction of a second before she answered. "Oh, I just grabbed a salad from the deli near the office. Barely had time to eat it." The lie was so smooth, so casual, it could have slipped by unnoticed if I didn't already know the truth. My stomach churned as I forced myself to take another bite of lasagna. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Sarah was suddenly busier than ever, leaving early and coming home late. Each time, the AirTag told a different story. One night, she parked at a hotel on the outskirts of town. Another time, she spent 3 hours at a park before finally heading home. I started keeping notes, dates, times, locations. It felt ridiculous, like something a detective would do in a bad movie, but I needed to see the bigger picture. One evening, as she showered, I decided to take my search further. Her laptop was on the kitchen counter, open and unlocked. I hesitated for a moment, guilt clawing at the edges of my mind, but curiosity won out. I clicked through her browser history, my pulse quickening with every click. Most of it was mundane, shopping sites, work emails, but then I saw something that made my breath hitch. A series of searches for boutique hotels and romantic getaways near me. The dates matched up with her supposed work trips. My hands trembled as I closed the laptop. The evidence was mounting, but I still didn't have the final piece. I needed more. The breaking point came that Friday. Sarah had been in an unusually good mood all day, humming as she got ready to leave for another late meeting. She kissed me goodbye, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air long after she was gone. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys and followed the AirTag signal, my heart pounding in my chest. It led me to a dimly lit bar downtown. I parked a block away and walked toward the entrance, trying to act casual as I scanned the room. And there she was, sitting at a corner table with the same man from the cafe. Their heads were close together, and her hand rested lightly on his arm. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't even notice me standing just a few feet away. I turned and left before they could spot me, my mind racing. The AirTag had done its job, but I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I saw it with my own eyes, something undeniable, something she couldn't explain away. And deep down, I already knew I wouldn't have to wait much longer. The bar incident shook me, but it also solidified my resolve. I needed to go deeper, to uncover every detail of Sarah's secret life. The AirTag was my silent ally, but I knew it wasn't enough. If I was going to confront her, I needed undeniable proof, not just for me, but to ensure she couldn't twist the truth when the time came. The next morning, Sarah was unusually affectionate, slipping her arms around me as I brewed coffee. Her touch felt like a cruel reminder of what I'd seen the night before. "Morning, handsome," she murmured, kissing my shoulder. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. My stomach churned at the thought of what she'd been doing while I sat at home, thinking our life was intact. "Anything special planned for today?" she asked casually, sipping her coffee. "Just errands," I lied. "What about you?" "Heading to the gym and then maybe some shopping," she said without missing a beat. Her ease at lying was unnerving. She'd always been a terrible liar when we first met, blushing or fumbling her words when she tried to surprise me. Now, her stories were polished, seamless. Once she left, I grabbed my laptop and began my search. The boutique hotels she'd been Googling were a good place to start. I called a few of them, pretending to confirm reservations for an upcoming trip. Most couldn't provide information without a booking number, but one receptionist slipped up. "Oh yes, Sarah Bennett stayed here last month," she said cheerfully. "Is she planning another visit?" I thanked her and hung up, my hands shaking. The dates she'd stayed there coincided perfectly with one of her supposed work trips. I jotted the information down and moved on to her credit card statements. I'd always left the finances to Sarah, trusting her to manage our expenses. Now I logged into the online account for the first time in years. The transactions told their own story. Dinners at upscale restaurants I'd never heard of. Charges from lingerie stores she hadn't mentioned. And then there were the hotels, several, in fact, all in the past 6 months. My heart sank as I scrolled through the mounting evidence. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a new notification from the AirTag. She'd left the gym and was now parked at a motel off the highway. My pulse quickened, and I grabbed my keys. This time, I wasn't content to sit and wait. I needed to see what was happening with my own eyes. I arrived 20 minutes later, parking far enough away to avoid being seen. The AirTag pinged from the lot behind the motel. I crept around the back, my heart pounding in my chest. Her car was there, parked neatly in front of room 107. The curtains were drawn, but the faint hum of voices reached me through the thin motel walls. I felt a wave of nausea as I stood there, staring at the car I'd washed for her just last week. She wasn't even trying to hide anymore. For a moment, I considered barging into the room, demanding answers. But something held me back. I needed more than just circumstantial evidence. I needed to catch her in the act, to strip away any chance for her to deny what was happening. I retreated to my car, my mind racing with plans. I'd come too far to stop now. That night, when she came home, she seemed more relaxed than usual, even humming as she made dinner. I played along, asking her about her day as if nothing was wrong. "It was good," she said, smiling. "Busy but productive." I nodded, keeping my tone light. "You seem happy." She paused, a flicker of something, guilt, maybe, crossing her face. "Yeah, I guess I am. Just trying to enjoy life, you know." I forced a smile, biting back the urge to confront her right then and there. The moment would come, but not yet. Not until I had the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle. And so I waited. Watching. Planning. Knowing it was only a matter of time before her lies came crashing down around her. The pieces were all there, scattered across my mind like shards of broken glass. The AirTag, the boutique hotel, the mysterious man from the cafe, they painted a picture so vivid that it burned into my brain. But I still hadn't seen it with my own eyes. That was about to change. It was a Saturday morning when Sarah announced she'd be spending the day, volunteering, at an event downtown. She even kissed me sweetly on the cheek as she left, her floral perfume lingering in the air. The AirTag told a different story. Within 30 minutes, it pinged her at a location I didn't recognize, a strip mall on the edge of town. Curious, I grabbed my keys and followed. When I arrived, I parked a few spaces away from Sarah's car. The AirTag led me to a spot behind the strip mall where a cluster of motels stood in depressing disrepair. I kept my distance as I watched Sarah's car pull into a space outside one of the rooms. My breath caught as a familiar figure emerged from a nearby truck, the man from the cafe. I watched as Sarah got out of her car, her smile wide and glowing. She walked over to him, and they embraced like lovers reunited. My stomach churned, and my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Every fiber of my being wanted to charge out of the car, to confront them right there and then. But something stopped me. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording. They entered the motel room together, their laughter carrying across the parking lot. I sat there, staring at the closed door, my mind a storm of emotions: anger, betrayal, heartbreak. After a few minutes, I forced myself to act. I got out of the car and approached the room, my steps slow and deliberate. I could hear muffled voices through the door, followed by laughter that made my blood boil. And then, unmistakable sounds. Intimate. Raw. I leaned against the wall outside the room, my heart pounding so loudly that it felt like it might burst from my chest. This was it. There was no denying it anymore. She wasn't just lying to me, she was ripping our life apart in the most personal, visceral way possible. I knocked. The noise inside stopped abruptly. My pulse raced as I stood there, waiting. After a few seconds, I heard the shuffle of footsteps, and the door opened a crack. Sarah stood there, her face pale as she clutched a sheet to her chest. The color drained from her cheeks as her eyes met mine, wide with shock. "Mark?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here? What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice cold and steady. "That's a good question, Sarah. Maybe you can explain it to me." Behind her, the man appeared, hastily pulling on a pair of jeans. He had the audacity to look sheepish, as if this was some awkward misunderstanding and not the blatant betrayal that it was. "Who the hell is he?" I demanded, my voice rising. "And don't you dare tell me he's just a friend." Sarah stepped forward, her hands raised as if to calm me down. "Mark, please let me explain." "Explain?" I barked, cutting her off. "You think there's an explanation for this? For sneaking around behind my back, lying to me, and coming to places like this?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man stepped closer, his posture defensive. "Look, man, maybe we should all just calm down." "Don't," I snapped, pointing a finger at him. "Don't you dare tell me to calm down." I turned back to Sarah, my voice shaking with emotion. "How long, Sarah? How long have you been doing this?" She hesitated, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Her silence was answer enough. I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of it all, the lies, the betrayal, the sheer audacity, was too much. I turned and walked away, ignoring her desperate pleas for me to come back. "Mark, wait! Please! It's not what you think!" she called after me, her voice cracking. But it was exactly what I thought. And as I got into my car and drove away, I knew there was no going back. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we had, it was all a lie. Now, it was time to decide what came next. Driving away from that motel felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel. My knuckles gripped the steering wheel so hard that my hands started to cramp, but I didn't care. My heart was racing, my chest heavy, and every breath felt like it was laced with shards of glass. The woman I loved, the woman I thought I knew, had torn our life apart. And now, I was left with the wreckage. I pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, and sat there for a long moment, staring at the house. Our house. The place where we'd built a life together. Memories of Sarah and me laughing in the kitchen, decorating the Christmas tree, and hosting family barbecues flashed through my mind. All of it felt like a cruel joke now. Inside, the house was quiet, eerily so. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sank into the couch, staring blankly at the dark TV screen. My thoughts raced, replaying everything I'd seen and heard at the motel. Her lies. The man's smug face. Her desperate pleas as I walked away. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. I didn't need to look to know it was Sarah. The notifications had been flooding in since I left the motel, texts, calls, voicemails. I ignored them all. Whatever she had to say now didn't matter. An hour later, headlights swept across the living room window, and the familiar sound of Sarah's car pulling into the driveway made my stomach churn. I stayed on the couch, sipping my beer, as I heard her key turn in the lock. "Mark?" Her voice was tentative, almost timid, as she stepped inside. "Are you here?" I didn't answer. Instead, I let the silence stretch out, letting her sit in the discomfort of the moment. Finally, she appeared in the doorway, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Mark," she began, her voice shaking. "Please let me explain." I leaned back on the couch, crossing my arms. "Go ahead," I said coldly. "Explain." She hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "It's not what it looked like. I mean, it was stupid, and I made a mistake, but—" "Mistake?" I cut her off, my voice rising. "You call sneaking around with another man and meeting him at a motel a mistake? How many mistakes have there been, Sarah? How long has this been going on?" She flinched at my tone, tears welling in her eyes. "It wasn't like that. I swear, Mark. I never meant for it to happen. Didn't mean for it to happen?" I barked out a bitter laugh. "So what? You just accidentally ended up in a motel room with him? Spare me the bullshit, Sarah. I saw you. I heard you." She looked down, her face crumpling. "It started a few months ago," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to. I was just, I don't know, lonely. You've been so distant, so wrapped up in work." "Oh, so this is my fault?" I shot back, standing up. "Don't you dare pin this on me, Sarah. I was here. I was working to provide for us, for this life we built together, while you were out screwing around. I'm not trying to blame you," she said quickly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm just trying to explain how I felt. I never stopped loving you, Mark. I swear." "Loving me?" I scoffed. "You call this love? Lying to me? Betraying me? Meeting some guy behind my back? Don't insult me, Sarah." Her sobs grew louder, and she sank into the armchair, burying her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking." I wanted to believe her. A part of me, the part that still loved her, wanted to reach out and comfort her, to forgive her. But the image of her with that man, the way she smiled at him, the way she laughed, played over and over in my mind. It crushed any shred of compassion I might have had. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said finally, my voice heavy with pain. "You've destroyed everything. Our trust. Our life. I don't even know who you are anymore." She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face filled with desperation. "Mark, please," she begged. "Don't give up on us. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything. Just please don't walk away." Her words hung in the air, echoing in the silence. For the first time, I felt a flicker of doubt. Could we fix this? Could we somehow pick up the pieces and rebuild what she'd destroyed? But deep down, I already knew the answer. Some things couldn't be undone. Some betrayals cut too deep. "I need time," I said finally, my voice cold and distant. "I can't do this right now. You should pack a bag and stay somewhere else tonight." "Mark, please," she started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Just go, Sarah. I need space." Her shoulders sagged in defeat, and she nodded slowly. She stood, grabbed her purse, and walked toward the door. Before she left, she turned to look at me one last time. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I love you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. As the door closed behind her, the weight of everything came crashing down. I sank back onto the couch, staring at the empty room around me. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself cry. The house felt emptier than ever after Sarah left. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I sat in the living room for what felt like hours, nursing my beer as the weight of everything pressed down on me. My mind raced with questions I didn't have answers to, and the anger I'd been holding back bubbled to the surface. How long had she been lying to me? Was it just him, or had there been others? And how could she say she loved me while doing this? I wanted answers, but I wasn't sure I could handle them. Still, the need for clarity was stronger than my fear of what I might uncover. If I was going to move forward, whatever that looked like, I needed the full truth. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained. My body ached from the tension of the night before, and my mind was no better. But I forced myself out of bed, determined to take action. Sitting in limbo wasn't going to help me. I needed to know everything. I started by going through her things. It felt wrong, like I was invading her privacy, but after what she'd done, I didn't care. Her phone was the first thing I checked. She'd left it charging on the nightstand, probably too frazzled to think about taking it with her. It wasn't locked. Sarah had always trusted me not to snoop. Ironic, considering. Her messages told me everything I needed to know. There were dozens of texts between her and the man from the cafe, whose name I now knew was Matt. Most were flirty, some explicit, and all of them made my stomach churn. They spoke about meeting up, about how much they missed each other, and about things they couldn't wait to do the next time they were alone. The worst part was how casual it all seemed. As if betraying me and destroying our life together was just another part of their daily routine. I scrolled further back, piecing together their timeline. It had started 6 months ago, during a business conference Sarah had attended out of town. According to their texts, it had been love at first sight. They'd kept in touch, their conversations growing more intimate with each passing day. What began as texts turned into coffee dates, and then to stolen afternoons in motels. I threw the phone down in disgust, my heart pounding in my chest. The betrayal felt like a fresh wound, raw and bleeding. How could she do this to me? To us? I wasn't done. I needed more. I checked our shared laptop next, combing through her emails and browsing history. Sure enough, there were hotel confirmations, dinner reservations, and even lingerie purchases, all hidden under the guise of work expenses. By the time I finished, I had a folder full of screenshots, emails, and text messages. It felt like overkill, but I needed this. If Sarah tried to spin the story, if she tried to make me out to be the bad guy, I'd have the proof to defend myself. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I didn't eat, didn't shower, didn't do much of anything except sit with the weight of everything I'd discovered. Every time I closed my eyes I saw her with him, laughing, touching, lying. Late that evening my phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "Can we please talk?" her text read. "I'll do anything to fix this." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to respond, to scream at her, to demand answers to the questions swirling in my head. But another part of me, the part that was exhausted and broken, couldn't bring myself to engage. Instead, I left her on read and turned off my phone. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I needed time to figure out my next steps. I sat down with the evidence I'd gathered, organizing it into a clear timeline. If I decided to pursue a divorce, I wanted to be prepared. That thought, divorce, hit me like a punch to the gut. It felt so final, so absolute. But could I stay in this marriage after what she'd done? Could I ever trust her again? I called my best friend, Ryan, someone I'd known since college. He was the only person I trusted to give me honest advice. When he picked up, his voice was warm and familiar. "Mark, hey! What's up, man?" I hesitated, unsure where to start. "Ryan," I said finally, my voice shaking. "I think my marriage is over." There was a long pause on the other end. "What happened?" he asked, his tone serious now. I told him everything, about the AirTag, the motel, the texts. By the time I finished, I was choking back tears. Ryan listened without interrupting, letting me pour out everything I'd been holding in. "Jesus, Mark," he said when I was done. "I don't even know what to say. That's awful. I'm so sorry, man." Yeah, I said quietly. Me too. What are you going to do? He asked. I don't know yet, I admitted. Part of me wants to try and fix it. But the other part. I don't think I can ever forgive her. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Whatever you decide, I'm here for you, he said finally. And don't let her guilt you into anything. You didn't do this. She did. His words gave me a strange sense of clarity. He was right. I wasn't the one who had broken our vows. I wasn't the one who had lied and cheated. This was her mess. And I wasn't sure I wanted to clean it up. The following days were a blur of planning and introspection. Sarah sent text after text, left voicemails pleading for forgiveness, and even showed up at the house once, but I didn't answer. I wasn't ready. I needed to process everything, to figure out what I wanted before I let her back into my life, even for a conversation. I spent hours going through the evidence I'd collected, replaying every memory from the last few months with fresh eyes. I started to see the patterns, the times she was working late, the mysterious calls she'd step outside to take, the sudden spike in her interest in new lingerie. How had I missed it? Or worse, had I ignored it, afraid of what I might find? By Friday, I couldn't avoid her any longer. She texted me that morning, her desperation palpable through the words. Please, Mark. We need to talk. I can't take this silence anymore. I knew she was right. Avoiding her wasn't solving anything, and as much as I hated to admit it, I needed answers. I texted her back, agreeing to meet at the house that evening. When she arrived, she looked like a shadow of the confident woman I once knew. Her makeup-free face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She clutched her bag tightly, as if it were some kind of lifeline. Thank you for agreeing to talk, she said softly, stepping inside. Her voice wavered, a far cry from the composed, confident tone she usually carried. I gestured for her to sit in the living room, but I didn't sit with her. Instead, I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. Talk, I said flatly. I'm listening. She flinched at my tone but nodded, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. Mark, I don't even know where to start, she began. I messed up. I know I did. I betrayed your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but just tell me the truth, I interrupted. How long has this been going on? She looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. 6 months. I nodded, already knowing the answer but feeling the sting of hearing it from her. And him? Is it just him, or are there others? Her head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. No! Just him. I swear, Mark. It was never about anyone else. Why? I asked, my voice shaking. Why did you do it, Sarah? Were you bored? Lonely? Was I not enough for you? Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. It wasn't you, Mark. It was never you. I don't know why I did it. I was lonely, yes, but that's not an excuse. I felt disconnected. Like I was losing myself. And Matt, he made me feel seen. Seen? I spat, the word leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. You think I didn't see you? I was here, Sarah. I've always been here, working to give us the life we wanted. But apparently that wasn't enough for you. She sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking. I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed everything, but I love you, Mark. I still love you. Please believe me. Love? I snapped. You think this is love? Sneaking around, lying to my face, humiliating me? That's not love, Sarah. That's betrayal. She broke down completely, burying her face in her hands. I'm so sorry, she choked out. I'll do anything to fix this. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us. I stared at her, my emotions a whirlwind of anger, pain, and confusion. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the life we'd built together. But the other part, the part that had seen her with him, that had read their messages and watched the lies unfold, knew that some wounds didn't heal. I don't know if I can do this, Sarah, I said finally, my voice heavy with exhaustion. I don't know if I can forgive you. Her head shot up, her tear-streaked face filled with desperation. Please, Mark, she begged. Don't throw everything away. We've been through so much together. Don't let this be the end. I turned away, unable to look at her. You let it be the end the moment you chose him over us. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally I spoke again, my voice cold and distant. You should go. I need time to think. She stood, her movements slow and hesitant. Okay, she whispered. I'll give you space. But please, don't give up on us. I didn't respond. I stood there, staring at the floor, as she walked to the door and left. When the sound of her car faded into the distance, I collapsed onto the couch, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The house felt emptier than ever, but this time, it wasn't just the silence. It was the realization that the life I thought I knew, the life I thought we had, was gone. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to try and get it back. The days after Sarah left were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. The silence in the house was suffocating, but even worse were the memories that lurked in every corner. The couch where we'd curled up on lazy Sunday mornings, the kitchen where she'd hum while making breakfast, our bedroom, the space we once shared, now felt like a battlefield, scarred by her betrayal. I didn't turn my phone back on for 3 days. When I finally did, there were dozens of missed calls and messages from Sarah. Her voicemails were a mix of apologies and pleas for another chance, her voice cracking with desperation. Mark, I know I've hurt you, but please, don't throw everything away. We can get through this. I'll do whatever it takes. Her words felt hollow, like a bandage too small for a wound this deep. But I saved them anyway, a small, masochistic part of me wanting to revisit the pain when I felt numb. On the 4th day, Ryan came over, unannounced but not unwelcome. He showed up with a 6-pack and that knowing look he'd always had, the one that said he wouldn't let me hide from this. Figured you could use some company, he said, setting the beer on the kitchen counter. I shrugged, managing a weak smile. Yeah, maybe. He cracked open a can and slid it across the counter to me. So, how are you holding up? Terrible, I admitted. I don't know how to feel half the time. 1 minute I'm furious. The next I'm just broken. Ryan nodded, his expression somber. Makes sense. You've been blindsided, man. But you can't let this destroy you. What am I supposed to do? I asked, my voice cracking. She's begging for another chance, but every time I think about forgiving her, all I see is them. Ryan leaned back against the counter, sipping his beer. Look, Mark, I'm not gonna tell you what to do. Only you can decide if she's worth a second chance. But whatever you choose, you need to be sure. This isn't something you can undo later. I don't even know if I love her anymore, I admitted, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. I mean, I used to. She was my whole world. But now, I don't even recognize her. That's fair, Ryan said. But let me ask you this, can you see yourself moving forward without her? Or would you always wonder what could have been if you tried? I didn't answer. The truth was, I didn't know. That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding since the day I caught her. I went into our bedroom, opened the closet, and started packing her things. It was harder than I thought it would be. Every piece of clothing, every pair of shoes, every little trinket told a story. The dress she wore on our anniversary, the scarf I'd bought her on a whim during a weekend trip, the earrings she wore on our wedding day, they were all reminders of a life I wasn't sure existed anymore. When I was done, I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the packed boxes. It felt like the end of an era, like I was closing the door on something I'd never get back. And maybe I was. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, and let the weight of it all crush me. The grief, the anger, the confusion, it all came pouring out in deep, racking sobs. For the first time in weeks, I didn't try to hold it together. I didn't try to be strong. I just let myself feel. The next morning, I called Sarah. She picked up on the first ring. Mark? Her voice was shaky, hopeful. We need to talk, I said. Face to face. Tonight. There was a pause, and then she replied softly. Okay. I'll come by after work. I hung up without saying anything else. I wasn't sure what I was going to say to her, but I knew I couldn't keep avoiding this. If we had any chance of moving forward, whether together or apart, I needed closure. That evening, she showed up right on time. Her face was pale, her eyes tired and red-rimmed. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of her guilt had physically diminished her. Come in, I said, stepping aside to let her in. She hesitated for a moment before walking past me into the living room. We sat across from each other, the tension between us so thick it was hard to breathe. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then, she broke the silence. Thank you for agreeing to talk, she said quietly. I know I don't deserve it. I nodded, my expression unreadable. You don't. But I need answers. Anything, she said quickly. Ask me anything, and I'll tell you the truth. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees. Why, Sarah? Why did you do it? She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. I was selfish, she admitted. I was unhappy, and instead of talking to you about it, I made the worst mistake of my life. It wasn't about you, Mark. It was about me. My insecurities, my need for validation. I let them get the best of me. Her words didn't make me feel better. If anything, they made me angrier. You could have talked to me, I said, my voice rising. You could have told me how you felt, and we could have worked on it. But you didn't. You chose to lie, to cheat. I know, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I know I ruined everything. But I want to fix it, Mark. I'll do whatever it takes. I sat back, shaking my head. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah. And even if I could, I don't know if I'd ever trust you again. Her sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. I watched her, my own emotions warring inside me. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would be okay. But another part, the part that had been shattered by her betrayal, knew it wasn't that simple. Go home, Sarah, I said finally. I need more time. She nodded, wiping her tears as she stood. I'll wait as long as it takes, she said, her voice trembling. I love you, Mark. I didn't respond. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: whatever happened next, I wouldn't rush into it. The days following our talk were an emotional roller coaster. Sarah had left, but her words lingered. Every time I thought I'd made a decision about our future, doubt crept in. Could I ever trust her again? Could we rebuild after the destruction she caused? Or was it better to cut my losses and walk away? I spent hours going over the evidence I'd collected, the texts, the hotel receipts, the AirTag data. I hated that I'd become the kind of person who spied on his wife, but at the same time, her lies left me no choice. If I didn't dig for the truth, I might never have found it. Ryan called me almost every day, checking in to make sure I wasn't falling apart. You don't have to decide anything right now, he reminded me during one of our late-night talks. Take the time you need. You're the one who was wronged here. I wanted to believe that time would bring clarity, but all it seemed to bring was more questions. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling mindlessly through my phone, a text from Sarah came through. Sarah, can we please talk again? I miss you. I miss us. I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I wanted to ignore her, but a part of me needed to face her again. Maybe this time, I'd get the answers I still craved. Me, come over tomorrow at 7. Her reply came instantly, thank you. I'll be there. The next evening, Sarah showed up at the door right on time, just like before. She looked different this time, less frantic, more composed. It made me wary. Was she truly remorseful, or was she just good at playing the part? Thanks for letting me come over, she said softly as I opened the door. I nodded and stepped aside to let her in. We sat across from each other in the living room, the same way we had during our last conversation. This time, I didn't wait for her to start. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," I began. "And I need to know something, Sarah. Why should I believe you won't do this again?" Her eyes widened, and she leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Because I've learned my lesson," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust. But I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I can be the wife you deserve." "How?" I challenged. "How can you prove that? Because right now, all I see is someone who lied to me for months and only admitted the truth when she got caught." Her tears started again, but I didn't feel the same pang of guilt as before. I needed her to feel the weight of what she'd done. "I'll go to therapy," she said desperately. "I'll let you track my phone, my emails, anything you need to feel secure again. Just tell me what to do." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Do you even hear yourself, Sarah? You're asking me to live in a marriage where I have to monitor your every move just to feel okay. That's not a marriage. That's a prison." Her sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. "I don't know what else to say, Mark. I love you, and I hate what I did. I just want to fix this. And I don't know if I can fix it with you," I said quietly. "Every time I look at you, I see him. Every time you touch me, I wonder if you touched him the same way. How am I supposed to live with that?" She looked up at me, her face crumpled with pain. "You don't have to make a decision right now," she said, her voice breaking. "Just don't give up on us." After she left, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the spot where she'd been sitting. Her words echoed in my head, but they didn't bring me any closer to an answer. Ryan's advice replayed in my mind. "Take the time you need." But how much time was enough? And what if the answer was something I didn't want to face? The next day, I did something I hadn't done since this nightmare began. I called a therapist. Not for us, for me. I needed help sorting through the mess in my head, figuring out what I wanted and how to move forward. The first session was hard. Talking about the betrayal, saying the words out loud, made it all feel real in a way I hadn't processed yet. But by the end of the hour, I felt a flicker of clarity. My therapist asked me a question that stuck with me. "Do you think staying with Sarah would bring you more peace or more pain?" It was such a simple question, but the answer wasn't simple at all. Because the truth was, I didn't know. Staying might mean holding on to the good memories, but it also meant living with the shadow of her betrayal. Leaving meant freedom, but also the pain of starting over. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. No matter what I decided, there would be no perfect ending. There would only be a choice, and the consequences that came with it. The weight of the therapist's question lingered in my mind. "Do you think staying with Sarah would bring you more peace or more pain?" It haunted me, demanding an answer I wasn't ready to face. I spent the next few days in a fog, barely eating, barely sleeping. The life I thought I had was gone, and every step forward felt like walking through quicksand. I knew one thing though, I couldn't keep living like this, suspended between anger, sadness, and indecision. It was time to take control of my life again, even if that meant letting go of what I once held dear. I called Sarah and asked her to come over. She sounded hesitant but agreed, her voice laced with a mix of hope and fear. When she arrived, she was dressed simply, her face free of makeup. She looked vulnerable, stripped of the polished exterior she usually wore. I wondered if that was intentional. We sat down in the living room, the same way we had so many times before. But this time, the tension in the air was different. "Final. Mark," she began softly. "Thank you for letting me come over. I know this hasn't been easy for you, for us, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Her voice cracked on the last word, and I could see the tears welling in her eyes. But I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. I'd cried enough for the both of us. "I've been thinking a lot," I said, keeping my tone even. "About us. About what you did. And about what I need to move forward." She nodded, sitting on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I understand. Whatever you need, Mark. I'll do it. That's just it, I said, leaning forward. What I need is peace. And I don't think I can find that with you. Her face crumpled, and she let out a shaky breath. Mark, no, please. We can fix this. I know we can. I shook my head. Sarah, I've tried to imagine a future where I can trust you again, where I don't wake up every day wondering if you're lying to me. But I can't. I don't think that future exists. Tears streamed down her face, and she reached out as if to touch my hand, but I pulled back. I love you, Mark, she whispered. I know I've hurt you, but I love you. Doesn't that count for something? Love isn't enough, I said quietly. Not after what you've done. You didn't just break my trust, you broke us. And I don't think we can put the pieces back together. She sobbed, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. Please, Mark, she choked out. Please don't do this. I didn't do this, Sarah, I said, my voice firm. You did. You made the choices that brought us here. And now, I have to make the choice to take care of myself. For a moment neither of us spoke. The only sound was her muffled sobs. Finally, she looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. Is this really it? She asked, her voice trembling. Are you really going to walk away from everything we've built? I nodded, the heaviness in my chest almost unbearable. I think it's the only way I can heal. I stood and walked to the door, signaling that the conversation was over. Sarah hesitated, her eyes searching mine for some sign of hope, but I had none to give her. Slowly, she stood and made her way to the door. As she stepped outside, she turned back to me, her face a mix of heartbreak and desperation. I'll always love you, Mark, she said, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, the weight of my decision pressing down on me like a physical force. That night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty space where Sarah had been. The house felt quieter than ever, but for the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel suffocating. It felt freeing. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be days when I missed her, days when I questioned whether I'd made the right choice. But deep down, I also knew I couldn't move forward while holding on to something that had already crumbled. This wasn't the ending I'd wanted, but it was the one I needed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally start to heal. The days following Sarah's departure were strange. The house, once filled with her presence, now felt like a shell of its former self. Her absence was palpable, and yet there was a certain weight lifted, like the air wasn't as thick, the silence less oppressive. For the first time in years, I began to think about myself. About what I wanted, who I wanted to be, and how I wanted to live. It was a terrifying thought, rebuilding a life I thought was solid, but it was also strangely liberating. The first step was practical, reaching out to a divorce attorney. I made an appointment with a firm that came highly recommended by Ryan. The attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Lisa Carter, wasted no time getting down to business. Mark, I'm going to be honest with you, she said, flipping through the notes I'd provided. With the evidence you have, texts, receipts, the AirTag data, you're in a strong position. We can make a solid case for an equitable divorce. Equitable? I asked. What does that mean? It means splitting assets fairly, considering both parties' contributions and the circumstances of the marriage's breakdown. Lisa explained. Infidelity doesn't always impact the division of assets, but in some cases, we can argue that it should. I nodded, absorbing her words. I'm not looking to ruin her, I said. I just want to move on. And we will, Lisa assured me. But it's important to protect yourself. Emotionally and financially. She handed me a list of documents to gather, bank statements, property deeds, insurance policies. It was overwhelming, but it felt like progress. A way forward. Back at home, I threw myself into the task of clearing out the remnants of Sarah's presence. Her clothes, her books, the little decorations she'd placed around the house, they all went into boxes. At first, it felt like ripping off a bandage, exposing raw wounds. But as the hours passed, it became cathartic. Each box I sealed felt like closing a chapter. The hardest part was our bedroom. The bed we'd shared, the dresser where she kept her jewelry, the photos of us that lined the walls, it all felt tainted now. I packed the photos away, leaving the walls bare, and replaced the bedding with a new set I'd picked up earlier that day. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In the evenings, I began to rediscover parts of myself I'd lost over the years. I picked up my guitar for the first time in ages, letting the music fill the empty spaces in the house. I went for long walks, the cool night air clearing my mind. I even started reading again, devouring books that had been collecting dust on the shelves. Ryan came over often, dragging me out for beers or just to sit and talk. He was a lifeline during those early days, his unwavering support keeping me from sinking too deep into my own thoughts. "Have you heard from her?" he asked one night as we sat on the back porch, the faint hum of crickets filling the air. "She's texted a few times," I admitted, taking a sip of my drink. "Mostly to say she's sorry, that she misses me. Are you going to respond?" I shook my head. "There's nothing left to say. She made her choices, and I'm making mine." Ryan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Proud of you, man. I know this isn't easy, but you're handling it better than most would." I smiled weakly. "Doesn't feel that way sometimes. But thanks." One afternoon, a week after Sarah had left, I got a call from Lisa. "Mark, I've drafted the initial paperwork for the divorce," she said. "I'll email it to you for review. If everything looks good, we'll serve Sarah with the documents." The words hit me harder than I expected. Serve Sarah with the documents. It made everything feel real, final. But as much as it hurt, I knew it was the right thing to do. I opened the email that evening, reading through the legal jargon with a heavy heart. Lisa had included a note. "Let me know if you'd like to adjust anything, but I think this is a fair starting point." The terms were straightforward: a 50-50 split of assets, no alimony, and a clean break. I signed the document, and emailed it back before I could second-guess myself. The next day, I got a text from Sarah. "Can we talk? Please. Just one more chance to explain." "For the first time since this began," I replied. "You'll be hearing from my attorney soon." Her response came almost immediately. "Mark, please don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do anything." I didn't reply. I had nothing left to give her. That evening, I sat in the living room, looking at the boxes stacked neatly by the door. Everything she'd left behind, everything that wasn't coming with me into the next chapter of my life. Tomorrow, I'd drop them off at her new place, a final gesture of closure. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. I was starting to pick up the pieces to rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, and the scars of this betrayal would take time to heal, but I knew I'd get there. One step at a time. The next morning, I loaded Sarah's boxes into the back of my truck. It was a strange feeling, handling the physical remnants of a life we'd built together. Each box felt heavier than it should have, not because of the contents but because of what they represented. Memories. Promises. Betrayals. I drove to her new place without a word, the route strangely familiar even though I'd never been there before. It was a modest apartment complex on the edge of town, the kind of place we never would have considered during our years together. Her car was parked in the lot, but I didn't bother texting her to let her know I'd arrived. This wasn't a social visit. After unloading the boxes by her door, I knocked once and stepped back. A moment later, the door creaked open, and there she was. Sarah stood there, barefoot and disheveled, her eyes puffy as if she'd been crying. She glanced at the boxes, then up at me. "Mark," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to do this. It's your stuff," I replied, keeping my tone flat. "Figured you'd want it." Her eyes searched mine, pleading for something I wasn't willing to give. "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" I hesitated. part of me wanted to turn and walk away, to leave her standing there with nothing but her guilt and the things she'd left behind. But another part of me, one that I hated, still craved closure. Against my better judgment, I nodded. She stepped aside, and I followed her inside. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, a far cry from the home we'd shared. She gestured for me to sit, but I stayed standing, my arms crossed. "What do you want, Sarah?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Again. For everything. I know I've said it before, but I need you to know how much I regret what I did. I didn't respond, letting the silence stretch between us. She continued, her voice breaking. I ruined the best thing in my life, Mark. I ruined us. And I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for that. Her tears started again, but this time, they didn't move me the way they once did. I'd seen too many of them, heard too many apologies. You made your choices, Sarah, I said quietly. And now you have to live with them. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I still love you, Mark. I always will. The words hit me harder than I expected, but not in the way she might have hoped. They didn't bring comfort or hope. They brought anger, frustration. How could you claim to love me and do what you did? I don't think you know what love is, I said, my voice steady. Because if you did, you wouldn't have done this to me. To us. She flinched, as if my words had physically hurt her, but I didn't stop. I trusted you, Sarah. I gave you everything I had. And you threw it all away for, what? A fling? Some guy who made you feel special? It wasn't about him, she said quickly, tears streaming down her face. It was about me. My insecurities, my stupid need to feel something different. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but it's the truth. I shook my head, the weight of her words pressing down on me. It doesn't matter why you did it. What matters is that you did. And now we're here. She looked at me, her eyes desperate. Is there really no hope for us, Mark? None at all? I hesitated, the answer sitting heavy on my tongue. Finally, I shook my head. No. There isn't. I can't go back, Sarah. I can't unsee what I've seen or forget what you've done. And I don't want to live in a marriage where I have to look over my shoulder, wondering if you're lying to me again. Her sobs grew louder, and she covered her face with her hands. I stood there, watching her break down, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what we'd lost. Relief for finally saying what needed to be said. I'm sorry, Sarah, I said, my voice softer now. But this is the end. I left her apartment without looking back, the door closing behind me like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, painful sentence. As I walked to my truck, I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd shed a weight I'd been carrying for months. The drive home was quiet, the radio off, my thoughts my only company. I didn't feel happy exactly, but I felt free. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I could breathe again. When I got home, I sat on the couch and stared at the empty space where Sarah's things had once been. It didn't feel like a void anymore. It felt like a blank slate, a chance to start over. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing: I'd get through this. One day at a time, one step at a time, I'd rebuild my life. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find peace. The weeks that followed my last meeting with Sarah were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Life had settled into a strange new rhythm, one where I no longer waited for her to walk through the door or wondered what secrets she was hiding. The constant tension I'd been living with for months was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of calm. For the first time in years, I had time to focus on myself. The house, once filled with memories I couldn't bear to confront, had slowly become a sanctuary again. I repainted the walls in the bedroom, swapped out old furniture, and added touches that reflected who I was now, not who I'd been in the life I'd shared with Sarah. The divorce process was surprisingly smooth. Lisa, my attorney, had been efficient and empathetic, making sure everything was handled swiftly and fairly. Sarah didn't fight the terms. Maybe she knew there was no point. Or maybe she thought it was the least she could do after everything she'd put me through. On the day the divorce was finalized, I felt an odd mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, and an undeniable sense of closure. I wasn't naive enough to think I was completely healed. There were still scars, and there probably always would be, but I felt like I could finally move forward. That evening, Ryan came over with a bottle of bourbon to celebrate, or commiserate, depending on how I was feeling. To new beginnings, he said, raising his glass. To surviving the storm, I replied, clinking mine against his. We talked late into the night, laughing about old memories and sharing hopes for the future. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. The weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, life began to feel normal again. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects that kept me busy and gave me a sense of purpose. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, went on weekend trips, and even signed up for a hiking group. Each small step felt like a victory. One day, while grabbing coffee at a local cafe, I bumped into someone unexpected, a woman named Claire, who I vaguely remembered from a mutual friend's wedding years ago. She was kind, funny, and easy to talk to. We exchanged numbers, and over the next few weeks, we started meeting for coffee and long walks. There was no rush, no pressure, just two people getting to know each other. Claire wasn't Sarah. She didn't try to fill the void Sarah left behind, and I didn't expect her to. But she made me laugh, and for the first time, I felt a spark of something I thought I'd lost forever. One evening, months after my divorce, I found myself sitting on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the kind of beauty I'd rarely taken the time to appreciate before. I sipped my drink and let the cool evening air wash over me, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. This wasn't the life I'd planned, and it certainly wasn't the life I'd wanted. But it was my life now, and I was learning to embrace it, one imperfect, beautiful moment at a time. I wasn't defined by Sarah's betrayal, nor by the pain it caused me. I was defined by how I chose to rise from it, to rebuild, to move forward. And as I sat there, watching the last light fade from the sky, I realized something. I was finally free.